Good morning. Welcome to the show this Friday, September 8th, 2023. Thank you for tuning in and glad to have you guys here. Let's take a look at this. This is called Exeter's Pyramid. And the thing is what they got running is a Ponzi scheme. It goes back for a long time. It goes back to the origins of how all of this really got started, even before the Fed. It goes back to the Middle Ages, and gold was always the foundation of money for the entire world. And what they did was they had these people called goldsmiths. They were what became later the bankers. And they used to keep the gold for people. And the reason why was very simple. Say a guy had a little bag of gold, full of gold. And he was a rich man. He went around town, and he would have rich clothes on. He'd have a rich house. And under his bed, he'd have a bag of gold. He'd have servants. Well, one of the servants could slip in the middle of the night or in the morning when he's cleaning the guy's bed and slip underneath the bed and grab his bag of gold, make off with it. Nobody even knew who took it. Then, 1 year later, the rich man wasn't the rich man anymore. The servant was. And so, in order to keep that from happening, in order to keep the rich people rich, the guy who had the bag of gold, they would go to the goldsmith. And the goldsmith would keep the gold for them in a vault or keep it someplace safe. Well, he had his gold safe now, and he didn't have to worry about becoming a poor man by having one of his servants steal all of his gold. So, in exchange for that gold, the goldsmith would write a little note that was basically a promissory note that says, hey, we're holding your gold for you. Here are these promissory notes for each piece of gold you give us. Here's a promissory note that we're going to pay you this gold back. Time passed, and what they did was people started to use those promissory notes. One guy would have a whole bunch of promissory notes, and he says, hey, I'll sell you these promissory notes to the goldsmith down the road. You can go there anytime and get the gold, but here's the promissory notes. Will you sell me your sheep for 2 of these promissory notes? And the guy says, okay, sure. So then what he did was they would just trade the paper. Well, the goldsmith saw what they were doing, trading the paper around, and he said to himself, hey, nobody ever comes to pick up their gold. They're all using these paper notes to trade with. I know what I'll do, the goldsmith said. He said, I'll print more of these paper notes than I have gold in the vault, because nobody ever comes back to get the gold anyway. And then they can use, this is money. This is just as good a money. But what it was the paper notes were actually what's called a derivative of the underlying asset, which was the gold. And so that went along fine. Printing all these paper promissory notes for the gold, and these paper notes were used as money. Until somebody come back and said, that had a lot of gold, and said, hey, I want my gold. Here's my promissory notes. Here's 5,000 of them. And the goldsmith went, uh-oh, I've been caught. And that was it. He didn't have the gold. He didn't have enough to cover the 5,000 promissory notes. And that was the origins of bank runs. Later, it got to the point where they continued with using notes as promissory notes. And, the United States government, their bills were actually promissory notes for gold and silver. And this is what Nixon was dealing with all the way up to 1971. They were using these promissory notes, what Nixon referred to as the speculators, were exchanging them in for real gold. because they didn't have faith in the U.S. dollar any longer. So Nixon said, I got to put a stop to this. He said, in order to stop the speculators, and see, this was actually a derogatory term, calling them speculators. They weren't really speculators. All they wanted was actual value in exchange for their hard work in getting those promissory notes, which are actually valueless. So, but Nixon, in all of his power, said temporarily we're taking us off the gold standard. It wasn't temporary at all. If you look behind my head, you see down there at the bottom of that pyramid, first it's derivatives and unfunded government liabilities, which are actually debt, non-monetary commodities, private business and real estate, corporate muni bonds, securitized debt and listed stocks, government bonds and treasury bills, paper money, in other words, cash, and at the bottom of the pyramid is gold. Gold is the core of it all. What little bit of gold there's out there is actually the core of the entire world's monetary system. And when the whole thing starts to collapse on them because it's so heavy at the top, and it's got such a tiny base, it comes down to a tiny little point, this thing's going to fall over at a certain point. It's all going to collapse. And this is what's in the process of doing right now. But it's so immensely large. You know, the World Trade Centers were huge buildings. Mega structures is what you'd call them. You know, even when they started to collapse, even when they're falling, it takes them a long time to fall down because they're so big. That's the way with this. And picture this as being the biggest Ponzi scheme ever run in the history of the world. It involves all of the Western nations, and it even involves the Eastern nations because they did get tied up in it. Now they're trying to separate, create their own equivalent of the World Bank, the Eastern nations, because they realize that this thing's collapsing. It's collapsing from within now at this point. It's like a building, and it's in a controlled demolition. And this is why a lot of things are getting worse and worse. It can't be stopped now at this point. But at the core, when it all collapses, I'll give you a little illustration to help you guys understand what it's all about. I got this enormous furnace. It's an old cast iron furnace that I salvaged years and years ago. It's got a 6-foot long firebox. If you can imagine that, if you guys got a wood stove at home, if you ever dealt with a wood stove, generally your firebox is only like 18 inches long. This thing's 72 inches long, the firebox. You can shove a whole tree in there. And years ago, you know, when I was younger, there used to be some snapping cold nights. Down to minus 20 or so, you know, Fahrenheit. And I used to build on some pretty good big fires in there. So one night I was in the process of building this big fire, and I was using softwood, and I was using old cut pieces of 2x4s and 2x6s from a construction site. And I loaded that furnace right up full. Right? Of all this wood. Tons and tons of wood. Softwood. But I also had an old hammer that I broke the handle on. Had a broken handle. And I threw it in there with all that other stuff. Now, all that other stuff in there, tons of softwood, you never found the hammerhead. Because it was like in there with all that other softwood. If you tried to find it in there, you wouldn't find it. It'd be like a needle in a haystack. But the next morning, I woke up, come downstairs, opened up the big furnace door, and there was the hammerhead laying on the ashes. Easy to find. There was nothing else in there except a smooth bed of ashes and this hammerhead sitting there, all cleaned out. Well, the gold is like that steel in the furnace. And all of these derivatives that they've built up around, these enormous pile of derivatives, right now it's impossible to find the gold. The gold's just a little thing down there underneath this big giant heap of... But when this thing crashes, all of that's going to burn up. And the gold's going to be like the hammerhead. It's still going to be there. And that's when you're going to notice it. That's when you're really going to see it, is when all of this other stuff starts to crash. And you have to realize that. So what price could it go to? It would have to quite literally go so that all the silver and all the gold in the world equals all of the value of other things that they've securitized in derivative, or turned into derivatives. And yes, the dollar's a derivative as well. So everything that's, like right now, you say, well, my car's valued in dollars. It's worth X amount of dollars. Well, if the dollar goes poof and it becomes worthless, you're not going to say my car's worth X amount of dollars anymore. Dollar ceases to function once it moves into a hyperinflation. It ceases to function properly. And you can't value things in it. You have to go back to valuing things in gold. You're going to say, well, what's my car worth? And maybe it was worth $10,000, a used car. Maybe it was a nice used car. Maybe it was worth $10,000, maybe $20,000 or something, a fairly decent used car. Now it just might, when all this is said and done, it might be worth 1/10 of a gram of gold. That's how exceedingly high the value of gold. If gold has to cover, gold and silver have to cover all of these derivatives aspects of all the derivatives that they've created. And this is like the softwood in the furnace. So, I've heard stories in Weimar, Germany about this exact same thing happening. And people in the middle of this, toward the end of the hyperinflation, being able to buy things with gold and silver that were normally would be unbelievable. Like one guy, he bought I think it was a whole city block in downtown Berlin. If you can imagine, that would be like 100 acres of downtown property in downtown Berlin. I think it was for 7 ounces of gold. Now, this is a story. I'm not sure if that's true. But stuff like that does happen. Because what it does is when hyperinflations occur, they emphasize the importance of the metals to the core of the financial system and this pyramid that's behind my head. It just starts to show that it's all just a bunch of hot air. Everything that they've built up at the core is still gold. It's an enormous Ponzi scheme, an enormous bamboozle. But then when it fails, and it always fails suddenly, it takes a long time to get to the point of failure. But once it starts to fail, it goes down rather quickly from that point. And it goes down faster and faster and faster. Kind of like a building falling. When it first starts to fall, like when the trade centers first started to fall. They gain momentum on the way down. And the weight of the material above them crushed the material down below and even gained faster speed. So that it reaches terminal velocity in the end on its fall or its collapse. And that's what's happening. We're starting to move slowly. We're starting to collapse. We're falling. Everything's falling. And it'll gain speed. And I know that the Federal Reserve and the central banks, when they see it's all in free fall at a certain point, I don't know, it might be a few months down the road, they're going to try to stop that fall. And that's just going to make it go faster. Because they're going to inject a lot of money into the system, and that'll just make the hyperinflation go faster. Anyway, I've talked for a few minutes about this, but you guys got to understand, you can't put an upper price limit on gold and silver in a free fall collapse of the monetary system. It's fun to do. I mean, it's fun to say, well, silver's going to be 5,000 an ounce and gold's going to be 100,000 an ounce and stuff. But you're thinking still in terms of dollars. And you got to realize the dollar's just a derivative product. Okay, let's take a look at silver today. And see, I'm telling you guys, these silver riggers, these big banks that are suppressing the price of gold and silver, they know that this is the last stand for the dollar. And if they let this stuff go free, if they let this stuff go to where its value should be, everybody will want it. And they don't have it available to give you. In order to keep this game going, they have to really keep this suppression going and make it so that people don't want this stuff. Because this stuff is like never goes up to keep up with inflation. And lately, I mean, you know, it does over the long term keep up with inflation. But because of this suppression, I mean, this price was here, right where it is now, years ago. As long as they can keep it there. And they're going to lose control over it in the end because the Ponzi scheme's collapsing on them. And because they've held it back for so long, when they lose control, it's gonna all that coiled spring pressure is gonna go boing. It's gonna really jump fast when it really goes, when they finally lose control over it. But right now, silver's at 22.94. It's up a penny. A penny. Ooh, yay! And gold is up. Where is gold up? What's the live gold price here? I guess it's even with the board. I guess it's what, 1920? 1920.10? Let's take a look at cryptocurrency today, and we're looking at Bitcoin price at 25,866, and Ethereum is at 1629, and XRP is at 50 cents. Taking a look at the Dow Jones today, we're up 98 points at 34,599. Taking a look at crude oil is at 87.74. It's up 87 cents. Boy, we're getting up close to 90. Bonds and rates. We're looking at falling yields. The 10-year has fell 2 basis points at 4.24. And the U.S. 30-year is at 4.32, and it's fell 2.6 basis points. And the dollar index is 104.92, so it's almost 105. And she's going sideways today. Oh, I just got a heat warning. You can see it down there on the bottom of my screen. That's because the temperature's going up to 90 here today. And bright sunshine. So they give us heat warnings here if the temperature gets up too hot. They don't want people overheating and going into heat prostration and all that kind of stuff. I'll be careful this afternoon. I'm not going to stay inside, but I'll be careful that I drink lots of water and stuff. Thank you guys for listening to the show. Like and subscribe. Have a great afternoon, guys. And we'll catch you guys in the next episode. Bye-bye.